Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're asking, can Jacob Zuma hang on in what's a tough week for the South African president? He's the ultimate political survivor, but we're talking about it with former ANC Member of Parliament, Andrew Feinstein, who is the author of After the Party, Corruption in the ANC and South Africa's Uncertain Future. Also joining us from Johannesburg, Fahisa Hassan, Secretary General of the WITS Student Representative Council. And from London, commentator Joseph Dankwa. We were talking in part one of our discussion how there is this legal battle on the part of the government to suppress a report on corruption. There's also a legal battle that was fought on Monday between the finance minister and it seemed one part of the judiciary, the finance minister who saw charges against him dropped over improprieties when he was the head of the Tax Revenue Service. Reporters asked the man who made the decision, Sean Abrahams, National Director of the National Prosecutions Authorities, why he first pursued Pravin Gordhan for fraud and then dropped the charges, saying there was no criminal intent. Well, Abrahams, in his response, shrugging off accusations over an alleged meeting with President Zuma before taking up the case.
I certainly do not owe anybody an apology. Am I embarrassed or disappointed? I don't really want to answer that question. I certainly don't want to answer that question.
Andrew Feinstein, what's your reaction to this part of the story?
It's simply appalling. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about Zuma's attempt to get rid of a fairly respected finance minister. He then replaced him with someone who was clearly incompetent for the job and was in the pockets of the Guptas, the businessmen brothers you spoke about. And within 2 or 3 days, the South African currency, the rand, had collapsed by almost 40% as a consequence of that. So Zuma was forced to put someone who had been finance minister previously back into the role, someone he didn't want in the role. Now, the reason that he's trying to keep these people out of the role of finance minister is because they have to effectively loosen the purse strings so that Jacob Zuma can indulge in certain deals, particularly a multi-trillion rand nuclear power deal that he wants to negotiate with Russian President Vladimir Putin, and from which I imagine he would benefit from massive corruption. And any respected finance minister will not provide the budget for these sorts of deals. So who is in the finance ministry is of great concern to Jacob Zuma, because Zuma's only concerns now, because he's in his last term of office, if he survives, is first of all to ensure he has enough money to last him his retirement, and he goes through a great deal of money very quickly. And second of all, to ensure that neither he nor any of his family are prosecuted once he's out of office. And Pravin Gordhan, unfortunately, the current finance minister, is an obstacle to that. So there were these remarkable trumped-up charges by the National Prosecuting Authority, which is supposed to be a constitutionally independent body, but since the time of President Thabo Mbeki has been completely politicized. The irony of the situation is that Jacob Zuma was a victim of this politicization of the prosecutor's office when he himself was charged as the country's deputy president. Now he is using that exact same authority to effectively try and get rid of people who stand in the way of his material and political...
Trying but failing, it seems. I mean, he had a ruling go against him on Monday. We saw, of course, that recent ruling where he was ordered to pay back fees for the refurbishing of his personal ranch, his private ranch. So he may be trying that, but it's not always working. That does show that South Africa still has institutions.
Absolutely. I mean, there are some institutions that are really struggling in South Africa, like the prosecutorial authority. There are others, like the courts, most importantly.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Like the courts that remain remarkably strong, despite some appointments by Zuma to some of the senior courts. The majority of jurists in South Africa remain very independently minded and very committed to the rule of law and to the Constitution. And they have been the biggest obstacle to Zuma. And of course, that does show that there are elements of South Africa's democracy that remain intact. The other that I think is important to mention in all of this is the role of the media in South Africa itself, and particularly investigative media, who I think have done a remarkable job in scandal after scandal, bringing the information to the public, ensuring that the sort of outrage that we're experiencing at different levels in the society is being informed by the reality of what is going on. So yes, on the one hand, you have certain things that the president is doing that are shameful, basically. But on the other hand, you have elements of the country's democracy and its constitutional democracy that are pushing back against this.
And it's not just Andrew Feinstein. It's not just the president versus his own finance minister. There was a carefully worded statement on Sunday by the deputy president, Cyril Ramaphosa. He said, quote, "I lend my support to Minister Gordhan as he faces charges brought against him." Can we assume that that is Ramaphosa throwing his hat in the ring to replace Jacob Zuma?
I think so. I think that Cyril Ramaphosa, as you say, the deputy president, is in a very difficult situation. He is not an obvious Jacob Zuma supporter, but he has, as deputy president for a number of years now, been very uncritical of the president. And Ramaphosa has been criticized for that. I think, as Ramaphosa calculates, we are coming towards the end of the Zuma era. He is making the political calculation that he can now, in a guarded way, albeit, but he is now being guardedly critical of the president and of actions that the president is taking.
All right, so the finance minister can seem like a white knight in shining armor to some, but not to others. University fees have soared by 80% since 2008, leading the initial batch of protests last year that forced Zuma to scrap proposed increases for 2016. But with a budget deficit of nearly 4%, the finance minister finds himself at loggerheads with students protesting for free higher education these days.
We understand the concerns of our students and their parents, that we appreciate their difficulties, that we will do everything that is possible to regain normality on our campuses. We do not want them to lose the 2016 academic year. We want the violence to stop.
Fasia Hassan, what are your thoughts on the Finance Minister Gordhan, who says there's nothing we can do about it, the state coffers are empty?
That's not entirely true. We as the student movement had in the past taken on a view of let's call for free education, let's allow the policymakers of government to do their job, come up with a model, and essentially come back to the student movement with something. But unfortunately, that hasn't happened. And there's been a need for us to do the research and for us to develop a model. And in the process of developing this possible model for free and quality and a decolonized education, we have in fact found that free education is most certainly feasible and most certainly possible. It requires two main elements. The first being a reprioritization of spending. I mean, I can send you the documentation looking at a lot of wastage, there's a lot of corruption in the system. Very, very high budgets are going towards pretty much irrelevant portfolios and very much inefficient systems that we think money needs to be taken from. But what's most important here is less about the reprioritization and more about a lack of political will. Because all of a sudden, there'll be money to bail out parastatals. There'll be money to bail out the South African airline. There'll be money to bail out Eskom, which is one of the parastatals for electricity. Money becomes available when there's a need. Money is available for the president's home and for other sorts of lavish and exorbitant elements in politicians' lives. But all of a sudden, when we call for free education, we're told there's no money. And we know that's not true. And we've done the research, we've gone through the budgets ourselves. And in fact, we've been able to come up with the money through looking at those budgets, as well as a skills levy and a corporate tax.
On Wednesday, there's going to be demonstrations for the ouster of Jacob Zuma. For us watching this from outside of South Africa, would you say the lines are blurred between those who want to oust the president and those who are campaigning for free higher education?
I think that there are some blurred lines. Ours is the realization of a free and quality education. I think the problem has been that the current political leadership has not really taken it very seriously enough. I think that for Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan, to in fact say we want to save the academic year, but then they don't give us enough of a political win to go back to the student movement and send them back to class, is also very problematic. For the president to come into what we call an imbizo, which was a discussion, he read out a media statement and left without listening to what students have to say, is further indicative of the fact that the current political leadership is not taking the issue seriously. Is thinking that by putting more and more police forces on campus, by militarizing our university, by shooting us, by tear gassing us, by throwing stun grenades, that in fact they're solving the problem. And all they're doing is they're fueling it. All they're doing is delaying mass action. Because I can guarantee you that in January and February of next year, thousands, hundreds of thousands of students will be financially excluded, and we will see rolling mass action again. So in fact, Wednesday's demonstration, in many ways, you'll find a fair amount of students who are there because they're disillusioned with the current leadership, because they feel like they're not being taken seriously. But also, I think it's also unnecessary. I think that the political leadership as it stands need only come and listen to students, need only make a commitment to the realization of free education with tangible timelines, and we'll find a different story on the ground.
Andrew Feinstein, your reaction to what you're hearing there?
I think that Fahisha makes extremely valid points. I think that reprioritization in the budget is an essential. We're still, for instance, paying off the billions and billions of rands that we spent on this ridiculous arms deal that runs until 2018. Now, if some of that money had been utilized to subsidize university fees, you wouldn't have this catastrophe that we have in higher education. But I think as importantly as what Fahisha is saying, is that the issues that students are taking such strong action against speak also to deeper ills in the society. They speak about the sorts of levels of economic inequality that exist. They speak about the fact that under the ANC, in 22 years of a democratic government, there has not been a meaningful change in the economic structure of South African life and in the quality of life of the vast majority of South Africans. Now, that's manifesting in all sorts of ways every day. And I think that what has become apparent is that education is one of the key points for this frustration. And we've seen that in the nature of the mass protests by students across the country. But as I say, I think it speaks to the state of the country more generally than only in education.
So on that point then, Andrew, how close is Jacob Zuma to the door? Because we've predicted his downfall many times before, and he's always hung on.
It's extremely difficult, especially for me, a South African who lives abroad. So even though I'm back in the country a great deal, I think my perception has to be jaundiced by the fact that I live at a distance. I think there are a number of factors, though, that come into play here. For the first time today, we are seeing, for instance, the Secretary General of the ANC, who has made statements loyal to the president, saying whether the president stands down or not is on the conscience of the president himself. So this is a change in rhetoric coming from very senior echelons. I think the fact that the Nelson Mandela Foundation has now said that Zuma needs to go. I think the fact that there's an organization called Save South Africa that consists of, for instance, former ANC MPs, former cabinet ministers of the ANC, calling for Zuma to go, the pressure is building. However, set against that, one has to bear in mind that what has happened within the ANC itself is that a lot of people very disillusioned with Jacob Zuma have either let their membership lapse of the organization or have not remained engaged members of the organization. So it might still be possible for the president to rally significant support at a branch and a regional level of the ruling party that could see him survive longer than we might expect. But my hope personally for the country is that he goes as soon as possible. And I think we are closer to that point than we were even a few days ago.
Joseph Dankwa, on the world stage, South Africa over the past couple of weeks, making news, of course, with the student demonstrations, with the corruption allegations against Zuma, but also on another point, which is their announcement that they're leaving the International Criminal Court. Is that for foreign policy reasons, or does that tie into domestic politics?
It's all boils down to the perception which African leaders generally have had about the International Criminal Court. I mean, they've always seen it as a tool of oppression against African states. When there's a problem in Africa, the court is seen to double down and to go heavy-handed on the African countries. But all this boils into the mix of the politics, the dynamics of South Africa at the moment. South Africa is going through a very tense time politically and economically. And when things start rearing its head, then the true picture of governance comes to the fore. For me, whether them leaving the International Criminal Court is another question, or another question. But the main thing is that I look at South Africa presently going in a direction which it needs to do an about turn. The country as a whole, or the country specifically, needs to have a responsible leadership to take it in a new direction, to lead the continent. For me, Jacob Zuma and his presidency as the ANC president at the moment is failing, and they need to find a rallying point. But it leaving the International Criminal Court would cause a lot of African countries to do so, because they've been caused by countries like Kenya, when President Kenyatta was actually there was an attempt to prosecute him and it failed. Vice President Ruto of Kenya also gave up same views which have been expressed, that the International Criminal Court is used as a tool against African countries. And even President Nkurunziza of Burundi has also expressed it the same. So once South Africa takes the lead, other African countries will follow suit, because the AU also sees the International Criminal Court as a tool of oppression against Africa.
Let me ask Fahisha-san about, we've been talking about the gloves being off inside of the ANC itself. Young people, how does it break down? Are they more interested in joining newer parties like the Liberal Democratic Alliance or the more nationalist EFF of Julius Malema, or do they still believe in the ANC?
I think that's a difficult question to answer, but I'll answer it in at least my personal capacity, mainly because the student body is not homogenous. The interesting thing that we're seeing now is that myself and the other students were the so-called born-free generation, born into a democracy. Myself and others are members of the ANC Youth League, and other young members are also of the Progressive Youth Alliance, which is one of the political parties at a university level that has some affiliation thereof. And the interesting thing about Fees Fall, and the interesting thing about the rolling mass action, is that it was started by us as young members of the ANC. It was the PYL and SRC here at WITS that put our bodies on the line last year, that put our bodies on the line now. Former SRC President Nkabo Dlamini is currently in prison as a political prisoner, and he is a staunch ANC member. Former SRC President Shaira Kala was shot 13 times in the back by police at a close range of 1 to 3 meters away. She too is an ANC member, myself as well. I think we're seeing a very interesting kind of discourse in the youth population, particularly amongst those who, like myself, consider themselves ANC members, to basically say that this is not the ANC that liberated us, and this is not one that represents who we are. And there's definitely an attempt by other young members. So you're seeing the veterans of the African National Congress, and you're starting to see young people who are also not just calling for President Zuma to step down, but calling for a rooting out of that kind of corruption, of that kind of patronage. Because the problem is not just with President Jacob Zuma. The problem also lies with the kind of factionalism that we've seen, with the people who are supporting and backing him. And a question you posed to one of my colleagues is, do we think he's on the way out? Maybe. but he's going to put up a fight with everything that he's got. And I don't think he's going to go out anytime soon, ultimately because of how he's cemented his support through patronage and basically through ensuring that those who have who formerly had nothing now have everything, also have everything to lose. So we're seeing a very interesting kind of discourse. But just in closing, the current epoch that we find ourselves in is a space in which young people are saying, yes, we have a democracy, yes, we have a negotiated constitution, but ultimately on the ground, we don't have economic realities. We don't have the kind of equality that was spoken of. And look, how could we? I mean, it's only been 22 years when we're facing up with hundreds of years of colonialism, many, many years of apartheid thereafter. It's going to take us a long time. But as young people, we're saying we're not running away from the responsibility. We want to take the baton. We want to build South Africa. And we're merely beginning with the restructuring of higher education. Because once we move on from university, we're going to move into bigger and better spaces.
Andrew Feinstein, I want your reaction because it's an important point you made there by Aisha that, you know, again, Jacob Zuma's demise has been announced many a time and it hasn't happened. The ANC, after apartheid, built a winning electoral machine.
Yeah. I think a key part of that was obviously being the party of liberation. There were other parties involved in the liberation, but nobody captured that historical achievement quite as effectively as the ANC, and they certainly were the leading part of that liberation struggle. I think the point that Faisha makes is an absolutely essential one, is it's not just about the person of Jacob Zuma. It's everything that Zuma and parts of the ANC represent. It's the factionalism, it's the patronage, it's the convoluting of state and party in ways that I think weakens both. It's about the relationship between the leadership of the ANC and moneyed interests in South Africa and in the world. All of these have to be addressed if South Africa's liberation and South Africa's democracy is going to deliver to future generations. And I do think, I mean, what gives me enormous hope at what is a time of great difficulty to see the ANC in this sort of situation, what does give me hope is what is happening in Fahisha's generation. I think that the student movement in South Africa, which, as she says, it's very diverse. It's I mean, one can't encapsulate it as one entity of one view and of one mind. But I think generally that generation of people in South Africa do not have the political baggage that perhaps my generation has and the generation of current ANC leadership has. And that's an incredibly positive thing for moving the country forward to a meaningful and real democracy.
Andrew Feinstein, I want to thank you so much for joining us today from London. I want to thank as well Joseph Dankwa, Faisha Hassan in Johannesburg. We'll, of course, be watching how events unfold come Wednesday in those big protests. Stay with us. Our Media Watch segment is next. All right, so I got to say, we tried to reach out to pro-Zuma people who didn't come on the show. A lot of criticism of Zuma, but as you heard that student leader say, don't count him out yet.
Right. Well, certainly the vision you're getting on social networks is probably a bit skewed because it's maybe younger users and maybe that's representative more of the student protesters and such. But I did look for elements on social media that are in support of Jacob Zuma, but there's no major trends or hashtags that are sort of supporting him. But you do have a lot of Twitter accounts such as this one, Zuma Must Fall, and there's more than one. And you can see, I think, based on the cover photo of that Twitter account, that there are even some T-shirts that have been printed up. And they're also linking to other Twitter accounts such as Save South Africa. So there's quite a lot of, I suppose, connections being made on social media between getting rid of Jacob Zuma and saving South Africa. Make of that what you will. A majority of the nation probably sitting like this, hoping that the state capture report, so details of why Zuma is being asked to stand down, by these protesters being mentioned in hashtag hashtag form as well. Hashtag Zuma must fall. So you've got Zuma must go, Zuma must fall. Zuma must go, as I mentioned, is another variation of the same theme. Dear patriotic employer, please excuse your employees tomorrow, as we will be engaged in an historic event taking back South Africa. So that's an indication, I suppose, that people might be taking the day off work to indeed demonstrate their support for the movement. Mention also of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, a lot of reactions to that on social media. We call on the ANC to take steps to ensure the vehicle of state be protected and placed in safe and capable hands. That's very diplomatic language for saying, well, Zuma must go, I guess. And various journalists such as John Williams here saying, well, decoding that, saying that the Mandela Foundation is basically saying replace Jacob Zuma. What else do we have? You have pictures of clocks ticking, the pressure gauge. Well, this is a pressure gauge, it appears, not even a clock. The pressure gauge is climbing for Zuma to resign. It can't be long now, surely. And just one or two more. You've got some references to Malcolm X here. A man who stands for nothing will fall for anything. Time for those sitting on the parliamentary fence to show some spine and save South Africa from itself. So there you go. Lots of people organising on social media and expressing their desire to see Jacob Zuma stand down. All
right, many thanks, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel. I want to thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.